Hi everyone, I just thought I'd make this little video presentation so that we can think about a couple of issues that came up over the last couple of terms, and in particular something that came up around one particular Ofsted inspection, and which led us to think about a couple of really important issues that we might need to address. In the Ofsted inspections that happened last term, very few of the inspectors seem to have much understanding of the concept of mastery or teaching for depth in maths, and they had no real familiarity with the NCETM SPI materials, which is quite surprising considering that the DfE promotes those. In some cases, the opportunity to explain how we work and how we use the SPI materials, not as a scheme, was well received, generally speaking. But in one case, it led to the inspector needing to be convinced that all the elements of the national curriculum were being covered, leaving aside the fact that while academies are required to teach a broad and balanced curriculum, they're not required to teach all of the national curriculum, but leave that aside. In the absence of a scheme, he wanted effectively a what we do when diagram. So it's important for us to just go back over and realise what we mean by mastery, because there are different conceptions of mastery. So the original idea was put forward by Aristotle. So it's a very, very old idea of how teaching and learning should happen. But it was developed more practically in the 1920s in America by somebody called Carlton Washburn, who you may not have heard of, but also later on by Benjamin Bloom, who you will have heard of. So in a nutshell, the idea of mastery has always been that groups of learners follow small steps of learning until the vast majority of the learning group, perhaps about 80% of them, can show good understanding, and then they move on broadly together. So that's in opposition to the approach, which to us seems more traditional and is really embedded in math schemes, of moving on from a concept when the time allotted to it has ended. So we give subtraction 3 weeks and then we move on, regardless of how children have, regardless of the depth of learning that the children have achieved. And there are some aspects of pedagogy and didactics that are really important to that concept of mastery. So, for instance, formative assessment's important, knowing where the children are from day to day and being able to adjust in order to decide when to move on. That's important. Variation in task and approach. So, varying the task so that we know that if they've understood it in one way and understood it in another way, they've probably understood it. Deliberate practice, step-by-step practice, and regular revisiting of concepts. So we know there's a lot of research around spaced practice, and all those things are important aspects of pedagogy and didactics to that concept of mastery. And in recent years, the NCETM have developed some of these ideas a little bit more. So, for instance, they describe 5 essential elements of mastery as being representation and structure, being able to think about understanding different concepts being shown in different types of representations. Structure, representation and structure, so a concentration on the structure of the maths rather than just what we're doing. Coherence, which means small steps. Variation, both procedural and conceptual variation. Mathematical thinking is important. It's important that children talk about their ideas. It's important that children explain their ideas. It's important that we unpick common misconceptions, and obviously fluency, by which they mean procedural fluency. It's important that children develop procedural fluency. And although those are really important aspects of pedagogy and didactics, we know that they're essential for teaching in a mastery approach, and we also know that there's a really, really good research base for these things from the 2 EEF guidance reports on maths, and we've worked on these quite a lot over the last few years. So that really sums up, I think, what our approach to mastery is. So if we teach and use in a mastery approach, so we think that the time spent learning a concept should be determined by the way in which the learners develop their understanding of it, rather than the number of days allotted to it, then a what we do when diagram is unnecessary, because we wouldn't be limiting ourselves to a set number of days in order to finish the teaching of a concept. But there are 2 very, very good reasons why schools might find a what we do when diagram useful. Firstly, if there's an Ofsted inspector who doesn't understand or doesn't agree with a mastery approach, then a what we do when diagram will go a long way to helping them to understand what we're doing in maths. Secondly, we've seen from the way that we've used the spine materials over the last year or two that the time spent on teaching blocks can become unreasonably long. And so we'll try and think now how what we do when diagram would really help to try and cut across that. So let's just take the Ofsted reason for a minute. If we had a what we do when diagram and we set that out, but we just taught in a mastery way and just carried on teaching until children had understood it, then we'd sort of be behind the what we do when diagram, which is why we've not had one previously. But if we do one just for Ofsted, they will expect classes to be roughly where they're supposed to be in terms of coverage when they come. And if we've spent longer teaching one aspect, so we haven't quite got to where we should be on the diagram, then they might find that as a negative. Of course, that can happen if you're following any scheme, any time limited scheme anyway, because what can happen is you can get behind the scheme, and some people try to keep exactly to the scheme and some people don't. So that can happen anyway. And if that were to happen with a what we do when diagram, along with a mastery approach, then Ofsted could say that the organisation of the curriculum doesn't match the intent. We need to be very clear that some aspects of the national curriculum, such as measures and data, are very well covered in every year in the spine materials. We've done a little bit of work on this, and there's a document called National Curriculum Coverage, which we'll make sure that you get, and it shows where every aspect of the national curriculum in terms of measures and data in every year, it shows exactly in which teaching points of which spines those aspects are taught. And of course, it makes much more sense to teach these in the context of place and column value, for operations and fractions, and separately, because if you just teach them, for instance, bar charts without teaching them alongside addition, subtraction, etc. and comparison, then they're going to make slightly less sense. But there are aspects that are not covered, such as geography and time. And in the past, I've produced some non-spine blocks of works that cover geography and time, etc. And most year groups have had access to those, but we'll be developing those further and keeping them all in one place, so it's very clear where the aspects of the materials that are in the aspects of the objectives in the national curriculum that are not covered in the spines are covered. So if each school constructs its own what we do when diagram towards the end of the summer term, they can base it on a general template. So we've made a general template, a sort of like, this is what one might look like. But they can make it very bespoke on what children in each year group in that particular school have covered in the previous year to greater or lesser extent, and staggering the spine blocks, because it's not always a great idea to do, all of the place value, addition, subtraction block all from start to finish, and then do the multiplication, division, and then do the fractions. We've looked at how we might mix those up a little bit and mix in the other content, so that each school's what we do when diagram is very bespoke and fits in with the reality of how the children have learned in the previous year. So we're going to look at some examples of that now. So if for a year they've been using a small steps approach, say in year 3, and this went really well in the addition and subtraction and multiplication and division blocks, but the fraction blocks ended up being a little bit rushed, you might, at the end of the summer term, just before those children start year 4, plan in a little bit more time for fractions in year 4. Or year 3 might have got through all the spine blocks and did a really good recording on measures and data, so really done a great job on the spine blocks as part of it, but missed out, for instance, quite a lot on geometry. So in year 4, they're more likely be able to grasp the spine concepts relatively quickly. So we might say in year 4, because they've done really well with the spine blocks on addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, fractions, etc., but haven't done much geometry, we might think that it would be reasonable to reduce down the time on some of the spine blocks and put in some longer geometry blocks. Or, for instance, they may have used a scheme, or say, for instance, White Rose throughout year 3, so they've only covered the larger steps of learning. So they might, therefore, when they're moving on to the smaller steps, the more in-depth unpicking that there is in the next year group in year 4, they might take longer to grasp that depth in place value, etc., in the year 4 spines. We think by doing that they'll have a really good grasp of it by year 5, so we might sort of think in the following year they need to spend a little bit less time on it, so only have a short unit on fractions or shape or time in year 4 and load more into year 5 when they've kind of caught up with that depth. So we might, for instance, in that circumstance, start with a short multiplication division block at the beginning of year 4, and the fractions block might not take as long. So it makes each school's what we do when diagram very bespoke. Most subject leads are really aware of where all classes are in their progression at all times. So if I were to drop in and ask you as a subject lead, how are year 3 doing against the plan that you made? In most schools you'd be able to say, but that's really important. Subject leaders should be fully aware of where all classes are in their progression at all times. That's a really, really important job of the maths subject leader, so that adjustments can be made to the diagram in year to reflect the actual pace of progression. So for instance, if we find that year 3 or year 4 are taking a little bit longer to get to a particular point where we want to move on in, say, fractions, then we can adjust the what we do when diagram to fit in with the reality rather than the other way around, so that if Ofsted were to come, the what we do when diagram is always live and what you might call Ofsted ready. That way, the ideal that teachers can teach concepts for as long as they need to, determined by the pace of learning rather than strictly by the weeks allotted, but there'll always be a what we do when diagram for Ofsted to look at and compare learning with. So let's address this issue that some teachers take far too long working through the spines. We have noticed that quite a few teachers use the spine materials like a scheme and try to follow every single suggestion for teaching, which sometimes leads to the blocks taking an unnecessarily long time. And that's partly because over decades we've developed a scheme mentality, and we've been encouraged for a really long time to teach from a manual, particularly since the strategies. And it's understandable that teachers will find the process of re-professionalisation, deciding what to teach and how to teach on the basis of the class in front of them and how they're doing. It's understandable that they'll find that difficult to begin with. It's also because we've seen the situation where groups of children who have covered a topic in 1 year through a time limited scheme will have finished the topic, they'll have finished it, a big tick finish, but not understood the concepts deeply enough to handle the requirements of the next year. So a good example is that of children moving from learning about number bonds within 10 through a scheme in year 1 to needing to be able to use a deep understanding of them to connect that we can work out that 23 add 5 is 28 because we know straight away that 3 add 5 is 8. We found that children, where children are coming into year 2, haven't followed a small steps approach in year 1, they really struggle with this instant recall of number bonds within 10. And so therefore they're going to take a bit of a longer time to get through some of the spine materials. So a what we do when diagram might help to begin a conversation between subject leaders and individual teachers about the pace of teaching. That's definitely not to say that we encourage them to go quicker necessarily, just to have a regular professional discussion or coaching session, if you like, about where they are and how they're going. The real answer to this issue is to try and get teachers more familiar with S planning. We've had the mantra, or I've had the mantra for a really long time, that the best way to use the spines is to inform pedagogy and didactics. So that's summed up in the idea of read the next bit that you're going to teach, have a cup of tea, read it again, put it away, and then plan your lessons. The NCETM promotes this S planning way of planning, and I've written a short document about it, and I think we should make that a bit of a focus of our work as subject leaders for the next period of time. So here's one I made earlier. I produced a couple of sample what we do when diagrams. The basic difference between them is that one has the spine numbers and the other one doesn't have the spine numbers. And it's just a simple suggestion. It's a template to begin the discussion about what your school's what we do when diagram might look like. It's not something to be followed. It's a template to be moved around and fitted in with where your school is at any one particular time, and updated live throughout the year. So there are a couple of things we need to think about as well when we're thinking about our what we do when diagram. And one is there's a fundamental difference between the national tests in year 2 and those in year 6 should they carry on from now onwards. Some year 2 teachers treat them the same. In year 6, we want all of the children that we can possibly get to the expected or to the higher standard. So over the course of year 6, we cajole, we coax, we boost, we try to get as many as we can through to expected or to the higher standard. In year 2, we might not do that. Pushing children as far as we can to fit the bill for the TAF and the SATs in year 2 can have 2 negative consequences. Firstly, it can lead to low progress scores. We can see that in some schools where we've really pushed children to do really well in year 2, beyond what they're really able to do generally, we get really good scores in year 2, and then because they don't maintain that over the course of year 3, 4, 5 and 6, then that shows up as low progress scores. We're setting ourselves up for a much more difficult task in year 6 if we're doing our absolute best in year 2 and we're really pushing. I'm not saying hold children back. What I'm saying is we might have a discussion within each school as to what the ideal kind of level of attainment will be for year 2, so as to reflect how well the children have done, but also not to set ourselves up with too difficult a task to maintain and develop that in year 6. It also means sometimes that there's a bit of a lack of preparedness for year 3. So they've done very well in the TAF and the SATs. They go up to year 3, day 1, with X% of children at expected and X% of children at working at the higher standard. And we all know that often that doesn't quite marry up to what they can actually do, especially if we're asking them to really unpick the structure of the maths from the beginning of year 3. There is a document that I've sent around a few times that shows the links between the spine blocks, where things are covered in the spine blocks, and where things happen in the TAF and in the SATs tests. For year 6 is slightly different, and an approach that I would call forensic individual assessment is probably the best approach. Most, if not all, year 6 teachers use past SAT tests to make a kind of an assessment about where children are, and then to build up what lessons they need to teach based on that assessment. And that's good, and we should definitely do that. But there is an intrinsic problem with that, and the intrinsic problem is that it can underestimate the importance of the question domain. Take this example. If in one test the question 24,234 subtract 18,237 is presented like that, they might get that right. But if they get that right, we don't know that they could do that using the inverse. So we might not flag that as a potential problem. What we need to do is to show each of those calculations, so in this case a 5-digit subtraction, we'd need to show that with a missing value in all of the 3 different places, and you're unlikely to get that in one SAT test or even really across a number of SAT tests. So it'd be better to look at all of the calculations that come up in the arithmetic paper and see if children can do those with the missing value in all 3 places, because potentially it could come up with a missing value in all 3 places. So having a forensic type assessment as you go along. So if you're doing addition, subtraction, do all of the possible ways that it might come up in order to see what lessons you might need to teach. So research, particularly the EEF implementation guidance report evidence, strongly suggests that introducing a new idea to schools should be done after much preparation and then carefully and deliberately, rather than through a quick wholesale change. So for most schools it was correct. We're moving from following an approach where teachers follow a manual to one where they're applying a more developed understanding of pedagogy and didactics to their own classes, to try that approach out in a few classes with early adopters. That was completely the right thing to do. However, if schools are following a scheme in some years and using a small steps approach using the spine to inform pedagogy in others, Ofsted may say that that approach is not coherent and it's in transition. And we definitely don't want that, because transition statements in the inspection handbook can't be applied to the maths curriculum. Even though it suggests in the inspection handbook that it's a good thing that schools are developing their curriculum from year to year to improve it, with some Ofsted inspectors that's not the same thing. We don't know at the moment how long the current emergency will last. We don't know how the government will decide to address the missed learning time that children have had, or how long that will be. So just working on the basis that we're going to be back in school in September at some point, what we recommend is that schools which are due Ofsted in the next year start to use the small steps approach from September, and we'll support any school to get their what we do when diagram, their ongoing, their bespoke live Ofsted ready diagram ready for that time. And we suggest that schools due Ofsted do that in all years and show their structure in a what we do when diagram. And we also suggest that other schools think very carefully about considering to do that.